So I had an interesting conversation recently with a man who grew up going to church, but now considers himself an atheist. He told me that one of the biggest problems he had with church, and one of the reasons he felt justified in rejecting Christianity, was because he said, quote, "If God is so great and so loving and so gracious and so giving, why do so many Christians use him to get what they want?" And I'd never heard that one before. So I asked, like what things are you talking about? And he says, good feelings about themselves, money, a happy life, healing. Because if people truly loved God, they'd love him for who he is, not what he can do for them. I sat there for a second. I said, yeah, you know what? You're right. I can understand that. Like, that's a problem for me too. That's like loving the gift more than the giver, and that's never okay. Turn to Mark chapter 12. And the reason I start that way is because this is what the leaders of Judaism did in the first century. This is what the religious leaders who hated Jesus, this is what they did. They more than God, more than the giver of salvation, more than the favor of the Jewish people that he showed them, they didn't love God. Their whole religion was a show. Their devotion to God didn't come from the inside out. It was only outside. And Jesus talked about it this way. He goes, yeah, your religion, that all your devotion to God, he goes, it's like a coffin. It looks good on the outside, but on the inside is a corpse. It's ugly, it's rotting, it's smelly, it's gross. This is true of all religion that minimizes the Bible, rejects the real Jesus, substitutes works for simply trusting Jesus to rescue us from our sins. It's empty, it's hypocritical, it's a man-centered, self-promoting, pride-inducing scam. It's full of symbolism and endless rituals and pilgrimages and supposed miracles and lavish clothing and minutia, because there's no reality. There's no real substance there. It has no power to restrain the flesh. It has no true love for God or other people. It's hypocrisy. It's a scam. It's a fairy tale for adults. And Jesus, the popular understanding of Jesus is that he's just kind of like a happy hippie. He's a nice guy. He's always saying peace and love to everybody. But that's not the picture we get in the New Testament. You're there in Mark chapter 12. He has some pretty harsh words to say. And his harsh words are directed at false religion. This is the strongest language he uses, and it refers to true religion then and now. It applies across the board, and true religion hates Jesus for this. In this series, we've seen that false religion takes a hard stand against Jesus. There's no compromise between them and Jesus. Jesus doesn't let them. And what we've seen in chapters 11 and 12, as we've been going through this series, is that here's this group of people that just hate Jesus. They want to try to kill him. They can't do it, so they need Rome to do it for them. So they try to get him to say things to trap him, to trick them, to make him look bad, to cause the people to run away from him so that they have the opening they need to capture him, deliver him to Rome, and have him killed. Every time they try to trip him up, they end up looking like ants trying to stop a tidal wave. Like, they have no chance against him. He's God with skin. He's wisdom personified. Like he's God of very God. And so it's like you have no chance against him. And so after looking like embarrassing failures over and over again in chapter 11 and in chapter 12, they finally said, okay, we're done with this. We're not asking many more questions. We actually don't need to ask any more questions because our conclusion on him is settled. He needs to die. And that's where we are. This is Tuesday of the last week of Jesus' life. And so let me say something that might be kind of obvious, but maybe it's not. If there's like the thought, like, there's God in every religion, we just got to find God in all religions. Like, here's a religion, Judaism. Here's a religion, first century Judaism, that when God showed up, their response to God was, we need to kill you. Because you're cutting in on the things that are most important to us. There are things you're saying and doing that are causing the real God of our religion, which is really ourselves. It's causing us to feel uncomfortable and lose some of the things that we really want. And so actually, Jesus, you're not good for business, so we need to put you on a cross and get rid of you. And what we see in this passage is these are the last things that Jesus says to the crowds. He is done talking to the crowds. He is done talking to the religious leaders after these statements. This is the last thing he says to them. This is the height of, like, he's been teaching for 3 years, teaching the crowds, and this is the last thing he says. Look at verse 38. You've got to picture thousands of people. They're all in Jerusalem for the Passover. We're talking thousands and thousands, and it's like a roaming classroom, like wherever Jesus Jesus walks, these people, these hundreds and thousands of people are following him, and then religious leaders are coming in and trying to make him look foolish. And after all of that, when they finally said, you know what, we're done, they leave, we need to kill him, Jesus says, hey, people, listen up. Listen to what I have to say to you. Verse 38, in his teaching, he said, beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes, like greetings in the marketplaces, have the best seats in the synagogues, the places of honor at the feasts, who devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. Now, what Mark writes in these 3 verses is actually a summary of a longer speech that he gives in Matthew 23. So I want you to turn to Matthew 23 just to get kind of a flavor for what this longer speech was about and how Jesus, what Jesus had to say to the religious leaders. He's speaking to the crowd, so he's speaking to non-Christians, but he's also speaking to his disciples. If you look at 23:1, he's speaking to Christians and non-Christians, and he's saying, hey, listen up, you're in danger. There's some difficulty that you're facing. You don't even know it, but your pastors are not people you should trust. Your pastors are actually dangerous for you. Look at 23:1. Jesus says to the crowds and to his disciples, the scribes and the Pharisees, they sit on Moses' seat. So practice and observe what they tell you, but not what they do. For they preach, but do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear. They lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. They do all their deeds to be seen by others. Keep that in your mind. For they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. That's just, they want attention for their religiosity, and they love the place of honor at feasts, the best seats in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces, and being called rabbi by others. They love the titles. They just love being called rabbi or holy father or whatever. Drop down to verse 13. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. Notice this word, hypocrites. You shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces, for you neither enter yourselves nor allow those who would enter to go in. So you're stopping people from going to heaven. Look at verse 23. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. For you tithe mint and dill and cumin. You do all of this minutia. You've neglected the weightier matters of the law. You've neglected the things that matter, things like justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides, straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. Look at verse 29. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. You build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous, saying if we'd lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. We wouldn't have killed those prophets, even though we want you dead, Jesus. We wouldn't have done that, but we want you to die. Thus you witness against yourselves. You're sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your fathers, you serpents, you brood of vipers. How are you to escape being sentenced to hell? That's some strong language. And that's Jesus' opinion of a false religion, and it doesn't make Jesus happy to say this. He's not standing up there, with a, puffing his chest out going like, I'm awesome and you guys are awful. Like, that's not what he's doing. This breaks his heart. He's torn up about this. There's after 3 years of teaching and healing and sermons, and the result of all that is rejection. He's angry. He's broken. Look at verse 37. In response to all of this, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often I would have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings. And you would not. You weren't interested in that. See, your house is left to you desolate. Stands under God's judgment. And it continues to this day until, notice verse 39, for I tell you, you will not see me again till you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. This is the heart of what Mark records in chapter 12. And so turn back to chapter 12, verse 38. What we're going to see here, what we need to know here, first off, is that scribes were not like, they weren't minor cast members in the Judaism movie. They weren't bit players. They were the stars. They were the A-list actors. They were the top of the heap. They were the elite of the day, the best of the best. There was no one in religion better than the scribes in the first century. And they wanted to make sure that everybody knew that. Notice verse 38 again. That word like there in verse 38 means they take pleasure in. They take pleasure in walking around in long robes. They wore these robes to be noticed. These robes were meant to be something like they wore, like maybe at the synagogue, to say like, okay, I'm doing something special, reading, teaching the Bible. But what they would do is they would put the robes on to go to the store. They'd put the robes on to run errands so that people would look at them and go, whoa, holy man has just walked in. Just everybody hush. And in fact, when they would walk into the marketplace, if people would say, oh, hi, it's not just like being friendly. It's like, oh, the rabbi is here, Holy Father. And people would have to stand. And what it says there in verse 38 is that they take pleasure in that. They liked that. They enjoyed it when people kind of recognized their status and gave them their titles and showed some kind of awe for their religious authority, and what I read in reading a guy who's very familiar with rabbinic writings, he says that rabbis had the authority, in fact, to inflict religious punishment on people if they felt like their greeting didn't give them enough honor. Like there's a conversation between rabbis and one of them says like, well, they said peace be with you, but they should have said peace be with you, Master Rabbi. And they're talking about this, and you're reading that and go, are you kidding me? And they think like, no, this is the way it's supposed to be. Look at the part about the synagogues. They have the best seats in the synagogues. It'd be like a platform here, and they'd have a chair for these guys, and they'd be sitting up on the stage. And instead of, looking in one direction, over here, they would be sitting up here looking at all of you, and they'd be saying like, we're up here, and you're down there, and we're above you, and you're beneath us, and you better recognize that. They have the best seats at feasts. You see that in verse 39. So what this is about is when they went to a dinner party or they were invited to someone's house and there was some kind of like a place for dinner, they expected that the host would give them the best seat at the table right next to them. That there's this just air about them that you've got to recognize that their social status, like we are the elite of the elite. And they liked that, they took pleasure in that. That's all on the outside, but notice what the reality is. Look at verse 40. They devour widows' houses. They fatten themselves financially by consuming the estates of widows, leaving them penniless. We'll talk about that more in a minute. And notice in the middle of verse 40, for a pretense, they make long prayers. In other words, they pretended to be intimate with heaven. They pretended to be people that we know God, we pray to him all the time. But notice it says for a pretense. They're just kind of faking it. Because they're not really praying to God. They're not praying vertically. They're praying horizontally. Praying right at you. So that you will hear their prayers and go, wow, that guy is righteous. He's holy. What a great man. Jesus doesn't let them get away with that. Look at verse 40. He calls it pretense. He says this is a show. It's a scam. It's false. It's hypocritical liars. They don't recognize God when he's standing right in front of them. Like that's a key thing to recognize. Here they are saying, like, I'm all for God. God's incredible. I love God. I know about God. And God's standing right in front of him going like, you want to kill me. What? And then he renders his final verdict on them. Verse 40, they will receive the greater condemnation. They will receive the greater condemnation. Not they might or it's possible they will. It is a settled conclusion. And notice it's a greater condemnation. Greater than what? Greater than who? Greater than people who don't use religion to promote themselves. Greater than people who don't use their religious position and their power to promote themselves, to lift themselves up so that people look at them and go, wow, you are holy and amazing. And you are just the best. He says, yeah, that's not okay with me, Jesus says. This whole scam of self-promotion and self-importance, that's not okay. Their judgment, their condemnation, it says there will be greater. That word means abundant or severe or agonizing. It's not going to go well for them. And here's the thing, this isn't something that Jesus just saw, like he saw this for a week and was like, this is bad. This is something Jesus has seen for 3 years. And what he's seen is people taking religion and twisting it into self-promotion, taking God and making God a servant of ours rather than seeing themselves as a servant of God. And that's something that we need to be aware of. If we're going to avoid the same condemnation that Jesus gives these men, then point number one, you and I need to be concerned about false religion. We really need to be concerned about this. I know we're concerned about our retirement. So we're concerned about what our friends are doing. We're concerned about who's going to win the game tonight. Like there's so much stuff that we're concerned with that something like this is kind of relegated to, it goes from being like a main dish on a plate to maybe like the cherry on top. Like if I can get to that, we'll do that. But, there's more pressing issues. And what we see in the New Testament is there aren't a lot more pressing issues than false religion. Like I said a couple weeks ago, there's 26 out of the 27 books of the New Testament talk about false teachers and says they're coming after you. Like you've got a target on your back and they want you. You're the holy grail of all of their attention, all of their focus is you, and they want you. They're bent on taking you and taking you captive. Turn to Colossians chapter 2. I want you to see this. Colossians chapter 2. There's two kinds of false religion we need to be concerned with. And the first one is false religion outside of Christianity. We need to be concerned about this. Take a look at Colossians chapter 2. This is Paul's concern. It's about, Colossians is about 10 books to the right or so. If you get to a book that starts with a T, you've gone too far. Colossians chapter 2, look at verse 8. So this church has had false teachers come to it and has started causing problem and started making people like they're devoted to Jesus and they love him. It started to pull them away from Jesus and pull them to other things, lesser things, and in fact, things that cause problems. Look at chapter 2, verse 8, things that cause them to be held captive to things that are not Christ. Look at 2:8. See to it. Make sure that no one takes you captive. How are they going to do that? How are they going to grab you and hold on to you? They're going to do that by philosophy. They're going to do that by empty deceit that's according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. These are doctrines of demons. These are man-made ideas. These are empty. They have no power. There's no truth. But he says it has the ability, if you're not paying attention, if you're not being concerned, it has the ability to take you captive. That word refers to stealing, but it's not stealing. It's not stealing stuff. It's stealing people. It's grabbing you and saying, no, this is, you don't belong here with Jesus. You belong with us. It says, you better be careful of this, or using Jesus' words, you better beware. False teachers are out there. False teaching is out there, and you have to be careful. Because like I said, their goal, they like getting anybody, but they really rejoice when they get one of you. And these are not the ravings of a red-faced, vein-bulging fundamentalist. These are the cool-headed conclusions from a man like Paul who says, be careful, make sure that this doesn't happen to you. Or Jesus who just says one word, beware. Beware, watch out. It's coming for you. It's coming for your family. And in response to this, in a couple weeks, what we're going to do is we're going to do a summer series just called What We Teach, just to do a couple things. One, just to let you know, here's what we teach here. Here are our core ideas, our big doctrines, our main ideas that really drive what we do here. But it's also for the purpose of giving you the discernment that you need to continue to distinguish truth from error. There's a lot of error out there. There's a lot of falsehood out there, and it's not just there for no reason. It's there to pull you away from Christ, or it's there to keep people from embracing Christ. And so for you to help people, or for you to help to be able to know this for yourself, it's key that we do that. And so we're going to start that in a couple weeks. But there's a much more subtle form of false religion. It's not just false religion that's outside of Christianity. It's false religion inside Christianity. False religion right here, maybe even in this room. It's a lot more subtle, but it kind of fits the context. Go back to Mark chapter 12. It fits the context a little better, because here's the deal. Jesus isn't talking about another religion. He's talking about the religion of Judaism. He's talking about the religion of the Old Testament that these men were like representatives of. And so you would hear these men, you'd talk to and interview these guys, and they'd say yeah, I believe in the God of the Bible. creator, there's creation, and God is in control of everything, and he's holy, and he's good, and he's just, and he's loving. Like, they'd be able to say all of that. They'd get all the answers right. They'd be able to open the Bible to any, like you could do this. You just go like 1 Kings chapter 11, and they'd tell you the whole thing, maybe even quote it from memory. These guys knew their stuff, and Jesus says, you got to be careful of them too. Take a look back at verse 38. We're going to dig more into this subject of false religion within the walls of a church next week. But for now, just take a look at verse 38. They like to walk around in long robes, and they like greetings in the marketplaces. This is being religious so people will be impressed with you. This is crazy. This is craving people's applause, by dropping hints in your conversation about, how much Bible reading you did this week. Like we do this sometimes, like someone's talking about, I don't know, some kind of issue, and they're like, oh yeah, that reminds me about all the people I witnessed to this week. Let me tell you about that conversation. Or like people are talking about some other subject, and they go, oh yeah, by the way, I prayed so much this week. Every day I prayed. And we say it with like an air of, oh yeah, no, I'm just so humble, but really I want you to know that I'm a super Christian, So we throw that into our conversations. We do this on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, right? We throw quotes up there, and like, look what I'm reading, reading Spurgeon. You're not, I'm not reading any of that shallow stuff. I'm reading C.S. Lewis, and we throw that stuff up there. Now, is there anything wrong with doing that? Absolutely not. There isn't. But there is when we do that so that people will be impressed with us. That's not helpful. False religion can be showy, which means it's not modest, and it's not natural, and it's not real. And what that does is when we're not like that, when we're showy and we're trying to show people how great we are, what it does is it causes our mission field to look at us and go like, seriously? What's up with you guys? It actually turns people off. Because we come across as not real people. We come across as people, we know we're not even like that. But we come across that way, and our mission field sees right through it. Like Christians, we don't see it because we're all like doing it. But the non-Christians are just like, seriously? That's gross. And Jesus says that can seep in if you're not careful. Look at verse 39. And again, have the best seats in the synagogues and the public places of honor at feasts. This is false religion that has an air about it that they're better than you. It's, our kind of Christianity. It's more faithful and biblical and more godly than that shallow, weak, culture-driven nonsense, of those other places. It's our church is better than yours. Our music is better than yours. All of that stuff. And there's nothing humble about this because it's not Christ promoting. It's self-promoting. It's looking down on people who aren't like us. They're, it's like the rabbis on the stage, looking down on all the common people, all the, ignorant masses. I mean, is that attractive when people do that? Tell me more about how much better you are than me. I love hearing this conversation. Like, tell me more. Like, that doesn't, for some reason, like we do that and we think it's great, but again, our mission field goes, gross. No thanks. That's not helpful. That's not good. Then there's verse 40. And devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. False religion within Christianity does religious activity like praying or serving or whatever. They do it to impress people so that people will look at them and go, super Christian, that's you. Put a little star by your name in Sunday school. Like that's. Or the other thing that it does is it preys on the most vulnerable among us. Here's what the rabbis taught. The rabbis in the first century taught your contribution when you give money to the temple, you can actually get a blessing. You will actually get a blessing. Or if you give your money, God will save you. So it's salvation by purchase. And so this was the religion of the day. That's why Jesus takes on the temple. And when he describes the temple, he says, this is a den of what? Do you remember? Robbers. A den is a safe place. So Jesus is saying, you've turned my house from a house of prayer into a safe place for thieves. And that's what religion was doing, taking people's money and using it for themselves. And this same false religion exists today. It exists in groups that say, like, pay this amount of money and you'll get someone out of purgatory, or do all of these rituals over and over and over and over again, and maybe you'll spring someone to the celestial kingdom if you just do enough of these things. This is what false religion does. This is the so-called Christian television where TV preachers repeatedly and with no shame swindle the most vulnerable and desperate and simple and hopeless among us. They take their money with promises of health and wealth and prosperity and blessing, because false religion does not love its neighbor. It doesn't. False religion cares more about their money and separating them from it than it does about them. It sees our neighbor, it sees other people as a means to our end, rather than seeing us as a means to their blessing, as a means to caring for them. It takes my neighbor and it says, you exist to make me rich, or you exist to make me feel good about myself, or you exist, fill in the blank, over and over again. And again, our mission field sees that and goes, gross. I don't want to become a Christian. That's gross. And Jesus goes, I don't want my people to do that. Beware. Beware that there's false teachers out there who want you. Be concerned about that, but also be concerned that you might become like them. Beware, be concerned. What kind of religion does impress God? Turn to Isaiah 66. It's about, about 15 verses or chapters to the left. Isaiah chapter 66. What kind of religion? So Jesus going, this isn't good. This isn't what I want for my people. Beware of this. Don't do this. Don't emulate this. This is bad news. Isaiah 66. This is the kind of thing that gets God's attention. This is the kind of thing where God goes, this is the kind of thing that I love. This is the kind of thing that matters to me. This is the kind of thing that gets my attention. Isaiah 66, look at verse 1. Thus says the Lord, heaven is my throne. The earth is my footstool. You put your feet up on your ottoman, I put my feet on the earth. That's who I am. What is the house that you would build for me? Is there any building that you could make that would impress me? That's so much better than the Grand Canyon. That building you built, wow. Yosemite's got nothing on that. No, God's like, I built all of this stuff. What is the place of my rest? All these things my hand has made. And so all these things came to be, declares the Lord. But this is the one who I will look at. So I'm God of creation. I made everything. My heaven is my footstool. Like, I am God. I'm majestic. I'm awesome. He goes, but this is what grabs my attention. It's not all your religious activity. Notice, this is what grabs my attention. This is the one to whom I will look. He who is humble, scribes weren't that. He who is contrite, scribes weren't that. And trembles at my word. We're going to see they didn't even do that either. He was humble and contrite and trembles at my word. That's the kind of religion that God says, that's what I like. That's what I'm looking for. And go back to Mark chapter 12. Mark chapter 12. See, in response to grace, what does Jesus say our lives should look like? What is it like? You summarize this whole thing, what will it be about? Look at Mark chapter 12, verse 30. He says, this is what it'll look like. This is true religion. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Mark 12:30. And love your neighbor as yourself. That's what it looks like. So false religion doesn't love God. It's not really concerned with one's neighbor. And the thing about it is, this is where Mark goes next. Look at verse 41. So he says these final words to the crowds. He says, okay, done. And now verse 41, he doesn't leave the temple yet, but notice verse 41, he sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people putting money into the offering box. Many rich people put in large sums, and a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. And he called his disciples to him and said to them, truly, I say to you, this poor woman has put in more than all those who are contributing to the offering box. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she had, all she had to live on. So almost universally, this woman is seen as a contrast to the wicked scribes. She's seen as a paragon of virtue, a picture of a true follower of God. One scholar I read even called her a model of discipleship, an example to Jesus' followers of what complete devotion to God looks like. And for those who've been in church for any amount of time, really, and heard about this woman, I'm sure that that's what you've been taught about her, that you've read here or Luke 21 about her. And the application was something like this: you ought to give sacrificially, or you ought to give till it hurts, or you ought to give in a way that shows that you completely trust God, or you ought to give so that God is your God and that money's not your God. And that's what we learned from this woman. And maybe you really need to hear that message today. But I'm convinced this passage does not have that message. I don't think this poor widow is an example of Christian giving at all, in fact. And now, this week I probably read about 25 different scholars on this passage, and only 5 of them agree with what I'm going to tell you, so take it with a grain of salt. But I'm going to try to show you that this woman is not an example of how you give as a Christian. And here's my proof for that. Number 1, the conclusion that she's an example is based on assumption. Look at the text again. There's nothing in that text that says she's a follower of God. I read one guy that said she was a secret follower of Jesus. Like, okay, that's great, but you have nothing in the text that says that. And not only that, but there's nothing in the text that says she was giving sacrificially, she's giving because she loved God, she's giving because she has faith in God. Like, the text doesn't say that at all. So that conclusion is built on assumption. But second, if she's an example, then think about the principle of her life. The principle of her life would not be give sacrificially. If she's an example of Christian living, then wouldn't her example be to us, and the application for us be give everything you have? Wouldn't that be the application of this passage? Give everything, like empty out your entire bank account. Show that you trust God more than anybody else. Show that God is your God and not money. Like, you want to really do that? Put all your money in the giving box as you leave. Now, that doesn't match anything else the Bible says. I don't think she's an example. I don't think Jesus says she's an example. In verse 43, I don't think that Jesus says, hey, disciples, come here, I want you to see this. I don't think he does that because he's saying, hey, I want you to imitate her faith. I don't think she's an example. I think this woman is a victim. And I think that third because of the context. That's why Mark tells us about this woman right after he writes verse 40. Look at verse 40 again. What did the religious elite do to the most vulnerable among them? They devour their houses. And then the very next passage is a woman who gives all that she has left so that her house is devoured and she has nothing left. Do you see the connection there? So Mark's going like, she is an example of a religious system that devours widows' houses, that encourages destitute widows to give their last 2 cents instead of eating. And then think about the surrounding context, chapters 11 and 12. Everything we've seen up to this point is Jesus condemning false religion. False religion going, we hate Jesus, we reject him as the Messiah, and then Jesus saying, your God-dishonoring religion is garbage. Okay, so that's the context leading up to this. And then the context following this passage, chapter 13, is Jesus going, hey guys, let me tell you what's going to happen to this temple over here. It's all going down. It's going to burn down completely. So here's what you have. You have context, chapter 11 and 12, condemnation, condemnation. You have chapter 13, condemnation, condemnation. And then right in the middle, you have an explanation on Christian giving. Like it doesn't fit the context. I don't think the point of this passage is give till it hurts, or give all you have, or give what takes faith for you to give, or give whatever you can afford. I think to say this about Christian giving is to take the passage out of context. This woman, I think, is immortalized in this passage to teach us about false religion. Because again, the scribes taught that giving to the temple would mean blessing and even salvation. And they used all kinds of tactics to do this, mostly guilt and shame, to manipulate people to give. So I think this understanding sticks with the overall context of condemnation. This woman is an example of a corrupt system, of what a corrupt system does to people. Telling them, think about this, telling them in the name of God to give their last penny for a blessing. This is spiritual abuse. Here's what she says to herself. Either I take my 2 cents and buy my last meal. Because that was the cheapest thing you could buy in the first century. With those 2 cents was a piece of flour so you could make bread. So it's either I'm going to use this 2 cents to buy bread so I can eat, but the people, my pastors, the scribes, they tell me if I give this 2 cents to God that he'll bless me. So she takes it and gives it. And Jesus, I think, is ticked. Doesn't that sound like the TV preacher? You know, that whole scam, send me money. If you're down to your last penny, give, and God's going to open the floodgates of heaven and rain down on you blessing from above. Send me your money. God will bless you. I think what she did angered Jesus. It's hard for me to think that Jesus is impressed with a woman either going home to starve to death or leaving the temple to buy food stamps. Think about it. How would you feel if you saw a woman like a grandmother or a neighbor giving her last 2 coins that she had on this earth to a religious system that promised salvation or blessing or a miracle or healing or prosperity when it meant that she would go hungry? I think you'd be angry. I hope you'd be angry. And I hope you'd say, there's something wrong with this religion if it takes the last 2 pennies a widow has to buy food. And I'm sure Jesus was angry because look at chapter 13. He goes, chapter 13 happens right after chapter 11. So just pretend like 13 is not there and the events continue. So look at 13:1. And he came out of the temple. So he was in the temple, sees this woman, and then he leaves. And one of his disciples said to him, so they're walking away from the temple. This disciple looks back at the temple and says, Jesus, look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings. Isn't this great, Jesus? Look at this beautiful place. And Jesus said to him, do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. Jesus is not happy. He's not walking away going, gosh, wasn't that a great example? He is angry. And you got to ask yourself, why would God be angry at this? And I want to show you this. Turn to Exodus chapter 22. Exodus 22. The Old Testament is filled with passages about how to treat widows. This is not a minor deal. This is a major subject. And this is a major thing that these men were doing. Notice what God says here. Exodus 22, verse 22. God has a very special place in his heart for the most vulnerable. He doesn't just sit there and whatever with them. He cares deeply. Notice Exodus 22, 22. You shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry and my wrath will burn and I will kill you with the sword. And your wives shall become widows and your children fatherless. Don't mess with widows, God says. In fact, in Deuteronomy 24 and 26, God institutes welfare programs for widows to make sure that they're taken care of. Isaiah, God says through Isaiah chapter 1, verse 17, to plead the cause of the widow, to defend them, to take care of them, not take advantage of them. Jeremiah 22:3, these scribes were commanded to do no wrong to a widow. Jeremiah 49:11, they were supposed to encourage widows to trust God, not use God for a blessing so that it leaves them penniless. Deuteronomy 27:19 says that if you mistreat a widow, God says, my curse is on you. Like all of my anger and wrath is going to be on your head, he says, if you mistreat them. And then Malachi 3:5, God goes, if you oppress widows, you don't fear me. Either you fear me and you take care of them, or you don't take care of them, which means you don't fear me. And that's because Psalm 68, God is called the protector of widows. And according to Deuteronomy 10:18, God will execute justice for them if they are mistreated. So do you see why Jesus would not be happy at what he's seeing? Do you see why Jesus would look at this and go, this is abuse and I'm angry and this whole system's going down. And I'm going to take this, I'm going to destroy this whole thing. Because God is a defender of widows. He loves widows. He would not look at this and go, this is a good thing. Any religion that does this to the most vulnerable, desperate, hopeless people like widows makes the God of the universe its enemy. Now look back at Mark chapter 12. Look back at Mark 12. Verse 43, he calls the disciples to him. He said to them, truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the offering box. They contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she had, all she had to live on. Relatively speaking, like her gift was greater because she gave 100%. Like richer people can afford all that giving, but the poor were spiritually abused by their pastors because they gave under the illusion that this was necessary to be pleasing to God, to buy a blessing or even to purchase salvation. So I don't think this is about Jesus honoring her giving. I think she's a victim of a corrupt system that consumed her house, literally leaving her destitute. Verse 44, she now has nothing left to live on. Why? Because she's trying to live up to a religion that tells her this is how you earn heaven. This is how you get a blessing. Give your money. When really behind all of it, it's a scam. It's a system that existed so that the guys on top could get very rich and very comfortable and very prosperous, which is what false religion always does. And then the world stands back and goes, I will never be a Christian because I can see right through all of this. And Jesus goes, that's not my people. My people don't do that. This woman bought into a system that destroyed her, and I think it made Jesus furious, which is why he says God's going to destroy this whole thing. But the question then is like, what does this have to do with us? We're not doing that. We didn't do this. We haven't done this. But what this shows us is that false religion uses people for its own benefit. So instead, you and I, you should use yourself to benefit others. It's not using people for our benefit. It's using ourselves to benefit others. We've got to see ourselves as like, this is why we were saved. We were saved to be a blessing to other people. We get caught up in our culture, which says like, live for your comfort or live for yourself. And it's like, no, Christianity, I mean, think about it. We have a Jesus that says, my entire life was lived for your benefit, to take your place and pay for your sins. And so it's like, okay, if that's how Jesus lived, then that's how we're supposed to live. That we exist for the benefit of others, our time, our talent, our treasures, all of it for the blessings of others. That's the message of Christianity. It's the exact opposite of these men. So think about the others around you. And I'm not talking about the people in your house, although that might be where it starts. But if we think about our context of this passage, it's the most vulnerable around you. There are all kinds of vulnerable people around you. Right? It's not just talking about money, but if we start there, like people being destitute around us, like how do we respond to that? I mean, that's why we're giving to a program like the Harvest Compassion Center next week and saying, yeah, you're blessing people, like we want to bless you to be a blessing. So take all of this stuff and we want to use all of this to say, here's a fraction of what God has given us, use that to bless other people. Or the Walk for Life or Bibles to around the world. Like all of that is to be a blessing to other people who don't have what we have. But think about those who are, say, medically less fortunate than you. As you think about the health that you enjoy, like oftentimes people with health problems, either because of a disability or age, they just don't feel like they fit in. They don't feel like they connect because all the healthy people are doing their own thing and they're kind of slow and left behind. And Jesus says, no. Like think about the people who are less fortunate, let's say medically, and go, hey, wait. What about them? Or think about those who are socially less fortunate than you. You know, the kind of people that you just don't click with, you know, they're kind of weird. Or, you know, often people like that go, I don't last in church because I don't fit in. I don't connect to people. I don't feel like I belong. And Jesus goes, no. Like remember, you didn't really fit in with God. You and God didn't click, right? Our sin did not make us, you know, something where God's like, oh yeah, no, that's fine. It makes us completely different than him. And God's response was not, you're just so much different than me that I'm just going to be done with you. No, he comes after us. He says, I'm here to benefit you. I'm here to be a blessing to you. What about those who are spiritually less fortunate? Let's go to one more passage, 2 Timothy chapter 2. 2 Timothy chapter 2. There's those who are spiritually less fortunate than us. 2 Timothy 2:10. 2 Timothy 2:10. It says, therefore, I endure everything for the sake of the elect. I put up with anything, discomfort, being made fun of, physical persecution. Like, I put up with anything for the sake of the elect. Why? So that they may also obtain the salvation that is in Christ Jesus with eternal glory. They're less fortunate than me. They don't have the blessing of salvation that I have. So you know what? It doesn't matter. Like, I exist for their benefit, so I will endure anything to see God use me to reach them. James 1:27 says, religion that is pure and undefiled is this, that you visit widows and orphans in their distress. You don't cause widows and orphans distress. Jesus didn't see true religion that day in the temple. He saw false religion. And it broke his heart and it made him angry at the same time. And I wonder if it does that to us. But beyond that, the point of this passage, I think, is that these scribes, where Jesus says, beware, watch out for this. I think what Jesus is doing is saying, not just like they're dangerous and stay away from them, but also beware because of this. You could become like them. You could use God instead of love God. You could use people instead of love people. And so I think this passage is a helpful evaluation for us that true Christians aren't like these scribes. We should never be prideful or self-promoting or status-seeking or title-driven. We just want people to see how great Jesus is. We want to be humble and faithful and modest and just like, Jesus, you're all that matters. Use us to make much of you. And true Christians don't use people for our own benefit. We use ourselves to benefit others, to love the people around us in the same way that we love ourselves. So as you think about that and as you consider that, just consider the fact that when it comes to Jesus, you are most like your Savior when you love God and you love others. So this passage is meant to help us with that. And it's convicting. Yeah, can it be convicting? Absolutely. People met me at the door last service and like, whoa, that was convicting. But I want you to hear this though. If it was convicting for you, that's evidence of God's grace. When Jesus said these things, he said these things with a broken heart and with their best in mind. He said to this group of people that hated him and want him dead, here's what you need to do to turn that all around. And their response was middle finger. We're going to do whatever we want and you're going to die. And that's the temptation for you right now. Just go, yeah, whatever. More Bible stuff, whatever. This is the God of the universe speaking to you. How will you respond? Let's pray. Jesus, this passage is very convicting. It goes beyond just our actions. It exposes our motives, and that's not easy. That's painful. But like I just said, that's evidence of your grace to us, that you haven't left us to fend for ourselves, but you've been gracious to us and kind to us and showed us like, this is what matters to me, and this is what's true, what is true about religion, and this is what's true, that you're God and we're not. The world doesn't revolve around us. And that at the end of the day, all creation will worship you, and that it's really foolish. It's really foolish to substitute ourselves for you and use people to benefit us. God, please, please, please take off these rough edges in our hearts that where we look in the mirror of these scribes and we actually see some of ourselves. God, remove that from our hearts. Make us humble. Make us people that love you and love others. I do this, and you will work in us to show our mission field that Jesus really is a treasure. He's worth giving everything to. To do this, please, I pray, for our good and your glory. Amen.